attention. Breaking moments ago, the Supreme Court with a decision that will allow the Trump administration to move ahead with their plans to cut the federal workforce, at least for now. Justice correspondent David Spott, give us the backstory here, reporting live from Washington. Hi, David.
Hi, Martha. A nice Tuesday afternoon win for the Trump administration. And it's funny because the justices normally are on their summer recess right now. Doesn't mean they don't work behind the scenes, but these justices have been busy because of these executive orders and the way they've made their way through the legal process. But this right now is a order from the Supreme Court essentially saying that a San Francisco judge who put a stop to the Trump administration from cutting several federal agencies, they're saying that the Trump administration, in fact, right now can continue forward as the case plays out on its merits. So,
all right, guys. Well, breaking news here today. The Trump administration has just scored a major victory out of the Supreme Court, not just in regards to DOGE cuts and the reforms of the federal workforce, which are obviously important enough in themselves, but it also stands as yet another victory in the Supreme Court against these lower level district judges trying to abuse the stays, the temporary restraining orders, the injunctions, etc., to try to rein in executive power and basically say to Donald Trump that, hey, I, Judge Boasberg, or I, Judge so-and-so, are the real president of this nation and not you. And this is yet another win for legitimate executive authority, which we'll fully explain today. Yes, the executive branch does indeed have the ability to reform the workforce of, guess what, these bureaucrats work for, the executive branch, but it also stands as another hit to the judicial insurrection and overreach and coup. And so we'll tell you all about it here today, and it is indeed a victory. It may be a bigger victory, perhaps, if we were able to avoid certain unforced errors from Pam Bondi and PR nightmares and disasters in regards to the Epstein stuff, but I'll also talk about that in today's video because, interestingly, these two things are connected. This is basically the paradox of Pam Bondi as Attorney General, which is when it comes to litigating stuff like this for the Trump administration on their behalf of the U.S. government, she does a decent job, right? She's not that bad at it for sure. But then on the flip side, you have this huge nightmare where you have the Epstein stuff and she basically grandstood about it. She tried to talk up a game she could not back up. She's lost a lot of trust with the base. So we'll kind of show you those two prevailing narratives here today, contrast them, and see where we stand here. But with that said, guys, do us a favor as usual. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. Subscribing here, guys, is not only the best way to support our videos, but it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And with that said, so this is the decision that we'll first explain today out of the Supreme Court, which is where they're clearing the way for Donald Trump's plan to downsize the federal workforce, to which I say I'm sure Elon Musk will be so happy, right? I'm sure he'll be giving us so much credit here today. Oh, no, that's apparently not the case. I don't think he actually cares. But, okay, whatever. That aside, today the Supreme Court on Tuesday cleared the way for President Trump's plans to downsize the federal workforce, despite the warnings here that critical government services will be lost and hundreds of thousands of federal employees will be out of their jobs. The justices overrode a lower court order that temporarily froze the cuts which have been led by the Department of Government Efficiency. The court said in an unsigned order that no specific cuts were in front of the justices, which is also very interesting because you have this case, right, where this, woke district judge, the judicial insurrectionist, not only tried to overreach their judicial power in the sense that, again, I'm going to make the strong argument here that the executive branch does indeed have the right to regulate itself, especially in compliance and in accordance with existing congressional law. But also, secondly, right, she puts a temporary restraining order on nothing. Like nothing actually specific. We're talking here specifically about an executive order that basically says, oh, we're going to intend to downsize the federal workforce. Here's broadly what we're going to do. But usually, right, in courts and litigation, you have to actually be talking about something specific, right? There has to actually be a defined plaintiff and a defendant, an issue at hand specifically, not just broadly, oh, I don't like the way you wrote that executive order. It sounds kind of bad and mean to me, so therefore I'm going to put a stay on it. But again, yet another example example here, guys, of ridiculous judicial overreach, which may also go to show here why two of the liberal justices, very shockingly, perhaps some might add, actually voted with the conservatives here in favor of the Trump administration. That's how overwhelming this decision actually was, because as you can see, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, well, go figure there, was the only dissenting vote, accusing her colleagues of a, quote, demonstrated enthusiasm for greenlighting this president's legally dubious actions in an emergency posture. By the way, that sounds so much like a judge trying to objectively interpret and talk about the law, right? I'm sure that's what this is about. You know, we call her an activist, whatever, and obviously there's liberal justices, there's conservative justices, but literally this is the rhetoric straight out of a Democrat pundit on CNN or something. Oh, greenlighting this president's legally dubious actions in an emergency posture. You're having enthusiasm. You're supporting 47, But okay. Jackson further here warned of enormous real-world consequences, saying here, quote, this executive action promised mass employee terminations, widespread cancellation of federal programs and services, and the dismantling of much of the federal government as Congress has created it. Now, I'm going to explain to you here today what actually the argument I made months ago when this first became an issue as to why the executive branch really does have, in my view, and by the way, now the Supreme Court's view, the ability to regulate itself, right? You do not, for instance, have to ask Congress for permission to, say, fire a bunch of federal workers. And why is that? Because yes, while Congress has created many of these agencies and, designated a purpose and funding for them, there is no specific law, for instance, passed by Congress that says, hey, you need to have 4,000 employees at the Department of Education, and they have to be this person and that person, right? Broadly speaking, guess what the bureaucrats obviously work for in the government? They go through the Office of Personnel Management, which is ultimately controlled. It's directly under the executive branch, okay? And so in the same way, frankly, that a member of Congress has the authority to, say, fire one of their staffers because they don't like the way that's going, the intern or whatever, why then should the president not have the ability to fire a federal worker? After all, they're employees ultimately of the president's branch of government. If there's a situation where, for instance, you have a government here where the president does have the ability to appoint, obviously with Senate confirmation, but still, it's his nominees for things like, say, the Department of Justice or the Department of Education, then what's the difference between appointing the boss there and firing the boss if you want versus firing a low-level bureaucrat? Again, it's the same, because why? These bureaucracies we're talking about, these very agencies, are under the purview of the executive branch. They're literally a part of the executive branch. And so the idea here that the executive branch does not have the ability to reasonably regulate itself in the way it sees fit, I've always found to be utterly ridiculous. And in that sense, then why is OPM, right, personnel management, even controlled by the executive? Why don't you just make it a part of Congress if it's supposed to be the congressional power? Oh, but wait, it's not. It's not, obviously. But anyways, but if you don't want to take my word for it, that's fair enough, fine. Take a listen here to what Justice Sonia Sotomayor, let's keep in mind there, right, one of the liberal justices of this court. It was, again, an 8-1 decision where Ketanji Brown Jackson, the dumbest, lowest IQ person on that entire court, had to say in response to Judge Jackson here. Sonia Meyer, concurring in the grant of the stay, says, quote, I agree with Justice Jackson that a president cannot restructure federal agencies in a manner inconsistent with congressional mandates, which I also pointed out there earlier, right? If Congress did create the agencies, you can't just necessarily abolish them without Congress, but you can absolutely, and you can, by the way, can't turn the Department of Education into, say, the Department of Defense just because you want to. But that said, yes, you can regulate the way it is run. Seeing here at Post 13, here, however, the relevant executive order directs agencies to plan reorganizations and reductions in force, quote, consistent with applicable law. Oh, they're actually following the law here. Can you believe that? Actually, the things the Trump administration is doing are not just made up or subjectively invented out of thin air. So therefore, in response here, again, to Judge Jackson, the application for stay and the resulting joint memorandum from the Office of Budget and Office of Personnel Management reiterates as much. The plans themselves are not before this court at this stage, and thus we have no occasion to consider whether they can and will be carried out consistent with the constraints of the law. Again, this injunction was like, oh, just don't, there's no, generally speaking, a judge is supposed to, rule on an action that's already happened. You cannot really make a ruling on a hypothetical future event considering the actual facts of what went down are not in front of you. So the whole idea here is ridiculous. Nonetheless, saying here, I join the court stay because it leaves the district court free to consider those questions in the first instance. And now, as a result, the Trump administration will essentially here have the ability to mass fire, lay off tens of thousands of employees at, I believe it's about 19 different agencies. And indeed, the new and reformed federal workforce can go forward as intended to be,
as the case plays out on its merits. So essentially back in May, several different agencies sued. They said that the Trump administration wanted to make cuts at the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Energy, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, HUD, Justice, Labor, State Treasury, and Transportation, pretty much all of them. Now the Supreme Court is giving the Trump administration victory some almost 6 months into the president's second term here, saying that they can go forward with these reductions in forces. You may remember that this was part of the DOGE effort when Elon Musk was still hanging out around the White House, but President Trump today, Martha, during the cabinet meeting said that some of those DOGE moves made sense, were important, and this was a campaign promise and a promise really of this presidency to cut some of these federal agencies, and now this administration can feel vindicated from the Supreme Court as they move forward and make some of these cuts, Martha.
So there you have it. Now, two things I want to note here, which is, first of all, the common stupidity of Ketanji Brown Jackson, the absolutely ridiculous activist judge that everyone is well familiar with, of course, appointed by President Joe Biden. Absolutely no surprise there. But I want to share around because you've seen now two different cases. First, it was Amy Coney Barrett in the last ruling just a couple weeks ago. Now it is even another liberal justice calling out her absolute stupidity and her lack of being grounded anywhere in the law, right? What was she saying last time about the former ruling in regards to the temporary injunctions? Basically saying it was boring legalese nonsense. It's like, you literally work as a judge. What do you mean it's boring legalese nonsense to go back and look at the historical precedent of how temporary injunctions are used and how they were understood throughout the history of our country, the Constitution? Oh, that's just boring. I don't want to read all that. Utterly ridiculous. And I think this graphic really does tell you all you need to know about what we're dealing with here, because you can see here's a chart of the words spoken by the new Supreme Court justices. As you can see, right? Ketanji Brown Jackson herself has spoken a whopping total in the arguments here of 11,000 words. By the way, you count all the male justices, the men on the court combined, you're talking there about only 9,000 words. And look at the chart here. Look at the difference, right? So you have her all the way out here, then Amy Coney Barrett down at 4,000, Sotomayor 4,000, Elena Kagan 4,000, John Roberts 3,000, Neil Gorsuch about 2,000, Samuel Alito 883, Clarence Thomas, who, we generally consider to be the single best one on the court, although, Alito definitely is good as well, 96 words. Does that not tell you so much about what you need to know, right? Oftentimes, those who know what they're doing, the most intelligent, sometimes do not need to use endless amounts of just yap for hours and hours. Of course, Ketanji, the very opposite of that. Yeah, that is a wonderful chart. So that's first of all, obviously she's an idiot. She's a moron. We have long established that. But secondly, I'd also like to talk about the very fear-mongering that was surrounding this case, which is essentially if the Trump administration makes hypothetical cuts to the future government bureaucracies that we're not even reviewing here, that could have irreparable harm. And of course, you heard so much fear-mongering about this. I think, for instance, back to tax season, where a lot of Democrats were ironically arguing that, the IRS is understaffed. And I'm saying, okay, they're understaffed, so they won't be able to do their job. To which I say, oh, isn't that so horrible? But they were also saying, I don't know if you guys remember this, that people's tax refunds were not going to come on time. This was the fear-mongering because they were trying to argue that, they don't have enough staff to fulfill them. And yet once tax season came and went and people's refunds for the most part came fine as usual. I mean, no real difference there. That story completely disappeared. We actually covered it on this channel a while back. Well, now in recent news, as further proof that like these bureaucracies are indeed oversized, they do not need as many employees as they are claiming here, right? About the fear-mongering, because you've also heard a lot of talk about Social Security. Oh, there's all these people being fired at the Social Security Administration. Therefore, seniors are not going to be able to access Social Security. Then no one's going to get their checks, right? Apparently, according to a report today, the Social Security Administration has completed sending out its payments 5 months ahead of schedule. This is, of course, dealing with the reduced, turns out here, right? Government efficiency, it's in the name. Efficient Social Security Administration, literally doing a better job with less people. I wonder how that works. Maybe perhaps the narrative that conservatives have been pushing, that there's a bunch of people at these agencies who basically drag them down, don't do anything. Sure, I'm sure they do some work, but overall they're not really necessary employees. Maybe some systems actually run better when you have a smaller, more well-organized team. These payments include both new and backdated payments under new laws passed in January. It was expected to take longer, but however, it did not. And so therefore, even the very fear-mongering, the talk about the cuts potentially touching those Social Security payments has yet to be realized. And they're going to keep pushing this, right? We talked about just a few days ago how the cuts supposedly to the National Weather Service, they were blaming on the floods in Texas, and we broke it down and we're like, no, that's not true. They were overstaffed. Okay, it had to do with local infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, this is what they're going to keep on doing. But again, in response to the victory today out of the Supreme Court, you have Attorney General Pam Bondi, perhaps the single most controversial member currently now in Trump's administration for understandable reasons, right? But she goes on here to say that the Supreme Court today stopped the lawless lower courts from restricting President Trump's authority over federal personnel. Another Supreme Court victory thanks to the attorneys at the Justice Department. Now federal agencies can become more efficient than ever before. And here is, as I said in the beginning, the paradoxical issue with Pam Bondi, which is that in terms of leading the Department of Justice, has she been perfect? No. Has she had a perfect track record in terms of like fighting the lawsuits with these woke judges and litigating for Trump in court? No. But largely speaking, has had a decent track record of success there, right? You know, is kind of holding the fort, I guess, at the very least you could say, fighting in the courts of the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, this is coming on the same exact day where she is being massively dragged through the mud, again, for understandable reasons, because she basically strung along the whole public about this. She said she had the Epstein client list on her desk, and it turns out now they're saying there is no Epstein client list, and I have my personal thoughts about that. But again, this is sort of how you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, I think, in many ways, because had it not been for the embarrassment that the Epstein stuff caused, you would today be looking at a day where we're saying Supreme Court victory, deportation victory, etc. We're actually doing quite well. But instead, this is what we're dealing with.
DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. I'm reviewing JFK files, MLK files. That's all in the process of being reviewed because that was done at the directive of the president from all of these agencies.
So have you seen anything that you said, oh my gosh?
Not yet.
Because look, here is the ultimate irony of it, is that on a day where Pam Bondi ought to be celebrating a major victory, she is not. And she's not because, again, here for justifiable reasons, she has largely lost the public confidence and support and trust in many ways of the MAGA base Trump supporters. And who knows, perhaps maybe even some people in the administration itself. That's just pure speculation, obviously. And that all essentially happened because she decided to be a yapper, right? She decided to sort of grandstand and make this show of stuff, the binders, all that. And then when it, of course, spectacularly backfired in her face, now you're dealing with a situation where I think there's a lot of open questions. Can she continue forward as Attorney General. And, let me actually sort of give my take on the Epstein stuff, because all this talk about how is there something being hidden in the FBI archives or not? I have said this repeatedly, even before this whole situation, that I actually personally do not think there is some type of hidden list or blackmail or something just sitting in the archives of the Southern District of New York that they're just refusing to declassify here. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I've long made the case, I've kind of had the instinct here, that if there is some type of smoking gun, I don't think it's just sitting there for us to find, right? I don't think that the global elites, for instance, as I said here, are not going to be stupid enough to write all of that down and stash it in an FBI file that can be easily declassified. And if that type of evidence perhaps existed years ago, again, this is just my take on it, that it likely since then has been destroyed or in other ways, some way hidden by the very supposedly powerful people or the FBI or whoever that might be implicated here in a way that, this is not really something that you're dealing with, right? And as I pointed out here, by the way, if you don't believe me, look at the JFK files, right? JFK is, of course, the issue that a lot of people, a lot of so-called quote-unquote conspiracy theorists, with the quotations there emphasized, have speculated for years, if we just declassify the files, we're going to find everything. And then what happens? You find some clues, you find some minor hints at what could have happened, but no real smoking gun, no real proof of anything, right? And that's what I went on to say here, right? If you really believe there's a mass conspiracy, you can't possibly believe the elites and FBI just wrote it down for us to find, especially considering, this all happened when? Back in 2018, 2019. Then you had Joe Biden as president for several years. Do you really think that so-called evidence still exists? And so here's my thing, right? About the whole Pam Bondi situation. I actually believe her in the sense that, she's basically saying, besides things we can't release because they're too gruesome to the public, there's not really much else to be declassified, right? I believe that for the reasons I just laid out, because again, I think stuff was destroyed a long time ago. But the problem you dealt with is that people like Pam Bondi, people like Kash Patel, and all the, Epstein files crowd, they were yapping, right? They basically spent years talking a game they couldn't back up. They were stringing us along saying, look, the files are on my desk. We're going to find all this and that, And then what inevitably happens when the moment that Trump basically said, okay, so then you're hired. Okay, go get to the bottom of it. Go find it for me. They can't find it, right? So, I think at the point now, you're at a situation where if you really want to get to the bottom of it, there's nothing to be found that has evidence in the files. Maybe you launch a new investigation, But of course, it would seem at the moment that Pam Bondi, Kash Patel are too overwhelmed to seemingly really do that correctly. And I think what happened early on in the term is Pam Bondi wanted to seem cool and tough, right? She wanted to make a statement, win over MAGA approval as the brand new Attorney General, and that, of course, backfired in her face. I'm bringing that all up to say, so here's currently the debate that MAGA is having with itself over Pam Bondi. Is, yes, on one hand, she's doing a good job, as we just showed you, right? Litigating on behalf of the president against these woke judges. Now, that said, is there perhaps the case to be made that someone else could do the job equally as well? Because, there's a lot of attorney generals, a lot of lawyers out there you could use. Sure, absolutely. But on the other hand, right, unfortunately, because she's basically muddied the waters here by destroying her own credibility, and that's objectively what she's done, that she can't really win over trust or approval either as the Attorney General because of this whole Epstein blunder where she basically said things she couldn't back up and created a huge PR nightmare, not just for her, but the greater Trump administration. I'm not really sure personally how I even feel about it, right? Should Pam Bondi remain as AG or not? Do the benefits outweigh the cost, or did she catastrophically screw up? I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on all of that in the comment section down below, because that's sort of an open question. But anyways, there you have it on the Supreme Court front, the Pam Bondi front. Last thing I want to note here is, in contrast to the victory today out of the Supreme Court, guess what? As soon as we win one case, what happens? Yet another low-level district judge steps in to do another freaking temporary restraining order or injunction. This is absolutely insane. Except this time, guys, this is not even about an act of the president. This is about an act of a Republican Congress. As you can see, a federal judge just yesterday stepped in and blocked the big, beautiful bill provision. Again, we're talking here about a law passed by Congress that would bar Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. That is right. Now, of course, the argument we've been hearing for such a long time has been basically that, Donald Trump is not a king. So if he wants to do this, as is long debated about his executive actions, He has to go through Congress, right? You have to pass laws. That's how things are properly done in America. Not saying that's necessarily true, but that's just the argument, right? But now you have a case where so you don't want to believe there's a judicial insurrection yet? That the very moment where Trump goes through the Congress, and guess what? Passes a law that's on a book. What happens again is a judge blocks it again, right? It's claiming temporary restraining order. Oh, let's litigate this, all this stuff. When, of course, I struggle to find, by the way, even how this is anywhere within the reasonable bounds of judicial review, considering what constitutionality is at hand in this case, right? Please explain that. Because again, this is a bill passed by Congress and signed by the president, so you can't make the action of, oh, well, the executive action violated the laws passed by Congress, because it's a law passed by Congress. So with that in mind, right? What aspect of the Constitution is even arguably somewhat violated by this, right? First Amendment, Second Amendment, Article 2, no one knows, because we're talking about Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. I'm pretty sure the founding fathers didn't write in any provision that would remotely ban that, right? But again here, what is it all about? The insane judicial overreach. I am fairly confident here, by the way, this will eventually be overturned. It's a ridiculous ruling. But just to give you yet another example of the wild judicial overreach we are dealing with here, the coup, the abuse of so-called judicial review, and hence why, by the way, on this front, right, we need a Department of Justice and an AG who is competent and being run well and fighting hard against this stuff and doing it effectively, and not bogged down by the distractions of other debates, because you basically created a self-inflicted PR nightmare. But anyways, there you have it, guys. Let me know your thoughts on all of this here in the comment section down below. What do you think of the Supreme Court ruling? What do you think of the Pam Bondi stuff with Epstein and all that stuff? What do you think, of course, of the new one here, the federal judge doing another restraining order on the big, beautiful bill? Let me know. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.